What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into must-start quarterbacks and tight ends for Week 15 of the 2022 fantasy football season. These are going to be quarterbacks and tight ends who you may be considering benching, who could be considered a little bit lower tier than those bona fide starters like Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, like Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews. These are guys who maybe have still played very well in the season, but you might be kind of on the fence about as we approach the first round of the playoffs. So as always, if you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, first up on the list, we've got Justin Herbert, who will square off against the Tennessee Titans, the team that allows the second most points to the quarterback position from a fantasy perspective. The team that just allowed a 33-point performance to Trevor Lawrence last week. Herbert looked really good last week as well. He's looked good the past couple of weeks, a little bit towards that midpoint of the season. We had a lot of questions about potentially trading or dropping Justin Herbert even. I really encourage you guys looking at the schedule moving forward to hold on to Justin Herbert. He's really rewarded you guys since week 11. He's had 18 or more fantasy points in all of his matchups. I know he only finished with 19.4 fantasy points last week, but if you watch that game against the Dolphins, he just looked very comfortable, very confident, and in command of his offense. Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, Gerald Everett, Josh Palmer, Austin Eckler, all the weapons around him looked in sync. Herbert finished the day with 39 completions off of 51 passing attempts, 367 passing yards, and 1 touchdown. I think he will definitely improve on those numbers from a fantasy perspective going into Week 15 against the Titans. He should be able to throw the football wherever the heck he wants to. This Tennessee Titans secondary is absolutely abysmal. They have a good pass rush. They are able to stop the run, but they cannot defend the pass to save their lives. Justin Herbert is a bona fide locked-in start as we approach the first round of the playoffs. All right, next up on the list, I've got Dak Prescott going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a team that allows the 8th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. The main reason I put Prescott on here is because I feel like over the last couple of weeks, a lot of fantasy managers have lost a little bit of faith in Prescott. Since week 12, he's had 17.8 or less fantasy points, and overall just hasn't really brought a high ceiling, because when we look at these last couple of games, these games have relied on the run game and the defense. But this is a game that will take place in Jacksonville. The last 3 games have been at home in Dallas. I think this is going to be a little bit of a more competitive game script. And now when we look at last week against the Texans, that was actually a relatively surprisingly competitive game script. But at the end of the day, I do think that this could be a matchup where the Cowboys are kind of in need of throwing the football a little bit more. Don't get me wrong, they are going to utilize Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott quite a bit, but I will not be surprised if Dak Prescott finishes with a little bit of a higher ceiling, closer to 20 plus fantasy points. So if you guys are relying on Dak Prescott, or if you own Prescott and kind of a lower tier quarterback like a Tom Brady, a Derek Carr, Deshaun Watson, whoever it may be, I think that Prescott is a really safe start this weekend for a really safe floor. And I do think he holds a little bit more upside overall in comparison to what we've seen the last 3 weeks. And keep in mind, when we look at the last 3 games, Prescott has played well overall in terms of his touchdowns. And overall, surprisingly enough, the Giants, the Colts, and the Texans have all played much better against the quarterback position than the Jaguars have on the season. I think that Prescott is a really solid start as we approach Week 15. Next up on the list, we've got the man, the myth, the legend himself, Mike White. Obviously, Mike White, we got a little bit of an asterisk here. There's a chance he does not play in Week 15, but he himself has indicated that he will be ready to go, dealing with some rib injuries. He was obviously knocked out of Week 14 against the Buffalo Bills, had to go to the hospital, make sure he didn't have a ruptured spleen or anything crazy going on. But overall, looks like he has some bruised ribs, and he should be able to suit up against the Detroit Lions here in week 15, the team that allows the most fantasy points to the quarterback position. This is an absolutely beautiful matchup for Mike White. If he is able to play, if he is good to go, he should absolutely finish with 19 or more fantasy points. He had 19.4 points against the Vikings in week 13. He had 24.8 points against the Chicago Bears in week 12. He had 10 points before he was knocked out of the matchup against the Bills. That was probably looking like his worst game overall, but I don't know. Things look pretty bleak against the Vikings in the first half, and he finished with a pretty respectable fantasy stat line there. Overall, this game is at home. If he's good to go against this Detroit Lions team that is going to keep things competitive, that is going to allow for a good offensive game script, and is also going to allow for a lot of passing opportunities, a lot of passing yards overall, and potentially a couple scores from the quarterback position, I really think that Mike White is a very solid streaming option for you. And if you feel like you are in a rough spot at the quarterback position this week, whether you have a bad matchup, whether you have a quarterback you don't believe in, Mike White is only rostered in 23% of fantasy leagues right now. He is absolutely worth the addition just for the opportunity or the chance that he plays against the Lions here in week 15. All right, moving into the tight end position, I've got George Kittle going up against the Seattle Seahawks up next. Kittle's your tight end 8 so far on the season. I get that in the last 3 weeks he's been pretty disappointing. He's had some pretty good matchups. Week 14, Tampa Bay. Week 13, Miami. Both of those teams in the bottom 7 against the tight end position, and he yielded you just 6.8 fantasy points or less in those matchups. 5.6 points against the Saints in week 12, although they played pretty good against the position on the season. In week 11 against the Arizona Cardinals, a team that's allowed the most fantasy points to the tight end position, he had 24.4 fantasy points. And here in week 15, he gets the Seattle Seahawks, the team that has allowed the second most fantasy points to the tight end position. I think that Kittle could be in line for a very solid performance. You know, there's always some risk with George Kittle in terms of boom or bust potential. I think this is a week where he could absolutely boom and give you a great stat line overall and give you a huge positional advantage over your opponent. We know that the tight end position has been an absolute wasteland outside of Travis Kelce this fantasy season. I think that George Kittle, though, here in week 15 provides you with a lot of hope and a ton of upside in a stellar matchup against the Seahawks. All right, next up on the list, we've got Dalton Schultz going up against the Jaguars, who have allowed the 9th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Obviously, we talked about Dak Prescott just a couple moments ago. Once again, I think that this is going to be a game script where the Cowboys may be in need of throwing the football a little bit more. And overall, Schultz has played really well on the season. You know, obviously he missed about 4.5 games, but he's still your tight end 15 so far on the year. It's week 7 of the season when both him and Prescott have been back and healthy. Essentially, he's given you 9.9 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for weeks 11 and week 13. While he may not be the most consistent tight end, when we look at consistency at the tight end position right now, he is actually pretty consistent, if that makes any sense. So double digits last week against the Houston Texans, 14.7 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 87 receiving yards for Schultz. That was a season high. He gets the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. They just gave up double digits to 2 tight ends on the Tennessee Titans last week. I think that Schultz is in a really good position for a solid stat line as we approach the first round of the fantasy playoffs. All right, the last player I want to talk about is GERALD Everett of the Chargers going up against the Tennessee Titans, the team that is allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. Everett comes in as your tight end 10 so far on the year. In the last 3 weeks, he's given you 7.8 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 13 fantasy points in week 13 against the Raiders. I know that doesn't sound incredibly enticing, but once again, when we look at the tight end position this year, that is pretty good overall. In week 14 against the Dolphins, 7.8 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 28 receiving yards. So the targets overall have looked really good. 8 targets last week, 6 targets in week 13. And overall, while there are a lot of options for Justin Herbert to throw the football to, it feels like Herbert is always looking for Everett in terms of a security blanket, and he shows out with a fair amount of targets, especially in big games. And this is a big game for the Chargers. This is a big game for The Titans, I just think that Everett is in a good position for good volume this week and a solid stat line. And don't forget that the Tennessee Titans just allowed a career day to Evan Ingram last week at the tight end position. 39.2 points for Evan Ingram, 15 targets, 11 receptions, 162 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns last week for Ingram. I don't think Everett's going to necessarily match those numbers, but keep in mind, Evan Ingram literally moved up to tight end 4 on the fantasy season after last week. I don't think it's too crazy to say here in week 15 that Gerald Everett could have a potential season high against the Tennessee Titans. He should be a smash play at the tight end position as we move into the first round of the playoffs. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you guys in the first round of the playoffs. I want to do anything I can to help you guys get to that championship and win your fantasy championship this year. And be on the lookout for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.